When the pandemic started, I found myself desperately looking for work. I had been making a living as a seamstress while finishing nursing school, but money was getting tight, so I accepted a job caring for an elderly man during the night. The pay was surprisingly good, and his house was only a few minutes from mine. He was 95 years old, lived alone, had never married, and had no children. Because of his age, nurses took turns watching over him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. On my first night, another nurse showed me around the house before leaving. It was beautiful, but old, and much larger than I expected. The kind of house where every empty room seems to add another layer of silence. There were only 3 of us on the property: the elderly man, myself, and the nurse who was about to leave. She told me I could sleep in one of the guest rooms or stay in the old man's bedroom, where there was a couch beside his bed. I chose to remain with him so I could react quickly if he needed anything. As she was getting ready to leave, she stopped in the hallway and pointed at a lamp near the main corridor. "Turn this one on before bedtime," she said. "Just in case." She didn't explain what she meant. She simply handed me the keys and walked out. That first night was uneventful. I switched on the hallway lamp, helped the old man settle into bed, and stayed awake to keep watch. He barely spoke to me, but I didn't think much of it. The next morning, the same nurse returned to relieve me. To my surprise, she mentioned that it would be her last day working there. She hadn't been there very long, but I didn't ask why. At the time, I wish I had. The weeks passed quietly, and nothing unusual happened. Every now and then, I would hear noises somewhere inside the house, but I never felt afraid. It was an old place, after all. Old furniture creaks. Wood settles. Doors shift slightly in their frames. I convinced myself that every sound had a reasonable explanation. Then one day, I ran into the nurse who had recommended me for the job. She smiled and casually asked, "So, have they scared you yet?" I laughed, assuming she was joking. "What do you mean?" She hesitated for a moment before telling me that strange things happened in that house, especially at night. According to her, every nurse assigned to the night shift eventually quit. The nurse who had trained me left because she was constantly frightened, even during the daytime. Apparently, she simply couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't believe it. By then, I had already been working there for nearly a month. I had never seen anything unusual. Only occasional noises. Doors opening by themselves. Footsteps that I assumed came from outside. Nothing more. She just laughed and said, "Maybe they haven't decided to show themselves to you yet." I tried to ignore her comment. I didn't want to start imagining things. As time passed, the old man slowly became more comfortable around me. He started talking more, trusting me. Then one night, he asked me not to turn on any lights after dark. At first, I thought the brightness bothered him. But whenever he woke up and noticed a lamp was on, he would become visibly upset. "Please turn it off," he would say immediately. "Turn it off." Eventually, I stopped questioning it. One evening, we were sitting in the dining room. It was still early. The only light on was the one above the table. The old man was quietly reading while I worked on my laptop. I was facing away from the entrance to the main hallway, completely focused on my screen. Then I heard it. A bedroom door opening. Slowly. Directly behind me. I looked toward the old man. He had already lowered his book. His eyes were fixed on the hallway. And just before he turned his head away, I heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps. Moving slowly along the corridor. They were unmistakable. At that moment, the house was completely silent. No television. No wind. No traffic outside. Only those footsteps. Step. 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 Then they stopped. And in that exact moment, an icy sensation spread across my back. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was absolutely certain that something was standing directly behind me, and I knew one thing. If I turned around, I was going to see it. I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity. In reality, it was probably less than a minute. Eventually, the feeling disappeared. The unbearable cold behind me faded away, and I forced myself to stand up. Trying to act as if nothing had happened, I slowly walked toward the hallway. It was completely dark, and at the very end of it, the door to the master bedroom stood wide open. I swallowed hard. The old man hadn't reacted at all. He simply returned to reading, as if he hadn't heard the footsteps or noticed the door opening by itself. That bothered me more than anything else. From that night on, I made sure every bedroom door was firmly shut before my shift began. But I quickly stopped doing that. Every single morning, I would find them open again. Not partially open. Not cracked. Wide open. All of them. I honestly don't know how I managed to keep working there. Things only became stranger. Some nights, I would suddenly smell fresh flowers drifting through the darkness. The scent was sweet and pleasant, but there were no flowers anywhere in the house. Other nights, the smell was unbearable. Rotting meat. Decay. A stench so strong it made me gag. And it would disappear as suddenly as it appeared. Eventually, I left the job. Classes had resumed in person, and I finally had an excuse not to return. At that point, the experiences frightened me, but I still believed I could handle them. I thought whatever existed in that house was harmless. I was wrong. 3 months later, they called me again. They only needed someone to cover a single week. I was on vacation. I needed the money. And despite everything I had experienced, I convinced myself that I could tolerate a few strange noises and odd smells. What I didn't realize was that whatever lived in that house no longer wanted me there. And it wasn't going to stay hidden anymore. That very first night after I returned, everything seemed normal. The old man remembered me immediately. He smiled. We talked. For a while, I almost felt foolish for ever being afraid. But there was one difference. He refused to be alone. Not even for a minute. If I walked into another room, he became anxious. Once, I stepped into the bathroom. By the time I came back, he was shouting my name in panic. Terrified that I had abandoned him. I had never seen him like that before. It was as if he knew something I didn't. And he was afraid that, if I disappeared, something else would come instead. It was around 2 in the morning. The entire house was silent. Outside, a cold front had moved in, and the temperature had dropped enough for me to pull a blanket over my head while watching a show on my phone. The old man was asleep beside me. For a while, everything seemed peaceful. Then I heard it. The sound of a door latch clicking. At first, I wasn't alarmed. I assumed the old man had gotten out of bed without waking me. But then I realized something. The sound hadn't come from the hallway door. It came from the other door. The one connected directly to the bedroom we were in. Slowly, I heard it open. My first instinct was to look toward the old man's bed. He was still there. Fast asleep. Not moving. I lowered the blanket from my face and stared at the doorway. The door was slightly open. Beyond it, there was only darkness. I lay there trying to process what I was seeing. Then the door moved. It shut. And opened again. Closed. Opened. Closed. Opened. Again and again. Violently. As if someone invisible was standing on the other side, swinging it back and forth. I was terrified. My entire body locked up. I couldn't move. I couldn't even sit up. All I could do was watch the door slam open and shut in front of me. There was no draft. Every window in the house was closed. Nothing should have been able to move it. Eventually, the door stopped. The room became silent once more. I reached for my phone, wanting to call someone. I was too afraid to walk across the room, too afraid to leave the old man alone, too afraid to do anything at all. Finally, I grabbed my phone and called my brother. By some miracle, he answered immediately. At first, I couldn't explain what was happening. I was crying, shaking, barely able to speak. When I finally managed to tell him, he said, "Turn on the lights. Wake him up." But I couldn't. I couldn't even get off the couch. Then he told me to leave the house. But I refused. I couldn't abandon the old man. So my brother offered to come pick me up. And that's when he convinced me. With trembling hands, I reached for the switch and turned on the light. The old man woke up instantly. He looked at me with panic in his eyes, and the very first words out of his mouth were, "Please, turn them off. Turn off all the lights." But this time, I wasn't going to listen. I ignored his request. For the first time since I had started working there, I refused to turn the lights back off. At least with the room illuminated, I felt like I had some control over the situation. The old man said nothing else. He simply stared toward the small adjoining room, as if he were expecting something to happen. Taking advantage of the fact that he was awake, I forced myself to stand. Every step felt heavy. My legs trembled so badly that I had to hold onto the wall for support. I walked to the small room and pushed the door shut as hard as I could. Then I dragged an old iron fan in front of it, wedging it against the door so it couldn't open again. Only then did I return to the couch. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I didn't even go to the bathroom. I sat there staring at that door for hours, waiting for it to move again, waiting to hear footsteps, waiting for something to touch the handle. But nothing happened. The old man eventually fell back asleep. Meanwhile, I counted every minute until sunrise. It was the longest night of my life. When daylight finally filled the room, I gathered enough courage to inspect the small bedroom. Slowly, I pushed the fan aside, opened the door, and looked inside. There was nothing there. No hidden passage. No open window. No person. No animal. Nothing. Just an empty room, covered in dust, completely untouched. I finished my shift, went home, and made a decision. I would never go back. Later, they contacted me several more times asking if I was willing to work there again. I refused every offer. I didn't care if they doubled the pay. I didn't care if they tripled it. I spent a long time trying to recover from what happened in that house. For months, I couldn't even listen to horror stories anymore, because whatever was living there, whatever walked those hallways, whatever hated the lights so much, it gave me the most terrifying experience of my entire life. And even now, years later, I still wonder why the old man was never afraid of seeing it, only of letting it see him. I rarely travel outside the city where I live. Most of the time, whenever I need to stay somewhere overnight, I end up staying with friends or relatives. Because of that, this trip was one of the few occasions when I had to find a place to stay on my own. My destination was a small town in the countryside, the kind of place where there were barely any decent hotel options. The reviews for the few available hotels were terrible, and I didn't want to spend 2 nights in a dirty or poorly maintained room. That was when I found a single vacation rental available. I had never used that kind of service before, but the photos looked promising. The house was simple yet cozy, much better than any hotel in the area. I sent in my travel dates, received a quick confirmation, and headed out on my trip. The town was about 14 hours away from my home. I left later than I had planned, and by the time I finally arrived, it was already late at night. My first impression of the place felt strange. It looked abandoned. The streets were completely empty. There were no parked cars, no people walking around, and no sign of movement anywhere. The shop windows were dark, the doors were locked, and nearly every house had its lights turned off. Of course, it was already well past midnight, so I wasn't expecting to find a lively town. Even so, something about that silence unsettled me. Maybe it was because I had never seen the town during the daytime. Maybe it was because the complete absence of sound made it feel as though everyone had disappeared at the exact same moment. I followed the GPS instructions down narrow roads lined with tall trees. There weren't enough streetlights to illuminate the way, and in some places the darkness seemed to swallow the road entirely. After a few minutes, I finally found the house. It stood out from the others. It was one of the only homes with its porch illuminated and its outdoor lights still on. I assumed the previous guest had simply forgotten to switch them off. At the time, that seemed perfectly normal. Today, I'm not so sure. I grabbed my bags, walked up to the front door, and checked my phone for the access code the owner had sent me. The electronic lock clicked open immediately. I stepped inside, locked the door behind me, and without realizing it, I had just begun sharing that house with someone who had been there long before I arrived. I left my bags near the living room and headed upstairs to take a better look around. The second floor was small. There were only 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The first bedroom looked like it had been prepared for occasional guests. It contained a single bed, a small dresser, and very little decoration. The second bedroom was larger, with a queen-sized bed and enough space to unpack my belongings for the next couple of days. I only needed 1 day to take care of the business that had brought me there, and I would probably head home as soon as I was finished. Still, I had booked the house for 2 nights. I didn't want to drive such a long distance without getting some proper rest before making the trip back. After putting away my clothes and drinking some water, I spent a little while scrolling through my phone. Nothing seemed wrong. The house was quiet, comfortable, almost welcoming. Less than an hour later, I turned off the lights, lay down, and closed my eyes. But sleep never came. I tossed and turned for what felt like forever, listening to the strong wind outside and the occasional creaks of the old wooden frame settling in the cold night air. Then I heard the first sound. A loud thud. Heavy, as if something had fallen somewhere inside the house. My eyes opened immediately. I sat up in bed and stared at the bedroom door. I tried to think of what could have caused that noise. Maybe an object had fallen over. Maybe a window hadn't been shut properly. Or maybe it was just the old structure reacting to the wind. None of those explanations felt convincing. Even so, I got out of bed. I slowly opened the door and looked into the dark upstairs hallway. No one was there. No movement. No sound. Only the faint whistle of wind slipping through some distant crack. I waited for a few seconds. Nothing happened. I stepped back inside my room and carefully closed the door. But something had changed. It was that strange feeling that's difficult to explain. The same feeling you get when you suddenly realize someone might be watching you, even though you have no proof. I stood beside the door, trying to listen for anything. Then I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a thud. It was a creak. Slow. Soft. Like someone placing their weight onto an old wooden floorboard. Then, another. And another. The sounds were moving. Crossing the hallway. And getting closer to my bedroom door. I froze. For a few seconds, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Old houses make noises. Wood expands and contracts. The wind can move doors, windows, and even make the floorboards creak. That was what I wanted to believe. But these sounds had a rhythm to them. They weren't random. They sounded like footsteps. Slow. careful, as if someone was trying not to be heard. I held my breath and pressed my ear against the door. The creaking echoed through the hallway once again. Closer, then even closer, until it stopped right outside my room. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I waited for a few seconds. Nothing happened. I thought maybe whoever was there had walked away. Then the doorknob moved. It was only a slight movement, almost hesitant, but it was enough to send a shock through my entire body. I grabbed the doorknob immediately, pressing down on it with all my strength. At that exact moment, someone on the other side pushed against the door. The pressure increased. It was a person. There was no doubt anymore. Someone else was inside that house. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I kept holding the knob while feeling the stranger's weight pushing against the wood. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. It was as if we were both waiting for the other to give up first. Then the pressure suddenly disappeared. The person outside let go of the door. I stood there, too afraid to make a sound. Maybe they had left. Maybe they had simply opened the wrong door. Maybe. The door suddenly cracked open. Only a few inches. But it was enough. Instinctively, I threw my body against it. Through the narrow opening, I caught sight of part of a man's face. Only half of it. A dirty cheek. Extremely pale skin. Messy, unkempt hair. But what I've never been able to forget were his eyes. They didn't look frightened at being discovered. They didn't show surprise. They were filled with hatred. A deep, consuming hatred. As if my mere presence inside that house was an unforgivable offense. As if he genuinely wanted to kill me. I shoved the door forward with everything I had. After a few seconds of struggling, I managed to slam it shut again and lock it. On the other side, the man began shouting words I couldn't understand. He was speaking another language. He sounded furious. Then I heard footsteps running down the hallway. Moments later, someone rushed down the stairs. A few seconds after that, the front door opened and slammed shut violently. He was gone. Or at least, I hoped he was. I remained there for several seconds, still pressing my body against the door. I could barely breathe. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to step back just to regain control of myself. The house became silent again. A heavy silence. The kind of silence that makes you wonder if the person is simply waiting for the right moment to come back. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and called 911. I explained that someone had entered the house where I was staying and had tried to force their way into my bedroom. To my surprise, the officers arrived very quickly. Much faster than they ever would where I live. They searched the entire property. They checked the bedrooms, the bathroom, the kitchen, the closets. They even walked around outside looking for signs of forced entry or footprints. But they found no one. They also couldn't figure out how the man had gotten inside. The officers advised me to spend the rest of the night somewhere else, and that's exactly what I did. The following morning, I finished the errands that had brought me there and drove back home, trying to convince myself that the whole ordeal was finally over. I was wrong. 3 days later, I received a message from the homeowner. There was a photograph attached. It took me several seconds to gather the courage to open it. When I finally looked at the image, a chill ran through my entire body. The owner had discovered a hidden area in the basement. It was obvious that someone had been living there for quite some time. There were blankets scattered across the floor, empty cans, food scraps, dirty clothes piled in one corner, and there were rats. A lot of rats. Many of them were dead. Some appeared to have been roasted over a small makeshift fire. Others showed signs of something far worse. They had puncture wounds from needles and strange injuries that looked as though they had been inflicted slowly, as if someone had taken pleasure in torturing the animals before killing them. Along with the photograph, the owner wrote only one sentence. Asterisk. I think we found where that man had been hiding. Asterisk. I stared at my phone screen for several minutes, trying to understand one thing. If that man had been living in the basement the entire time, how many nights had he spent wandering through the house while other guests slept without suspecting anything? And more importantly, why was he so desperate to get into my room that night? To this day, I still don't have an answer. And honestly, I'm not sure I'd want to know. There are memories that never truly leave you. No matter how many years pass, they remain buried somewhere in the back of your mind, waiting for the smallest reminder to bring them rushing back. Mine always begins with a family vacation to my grandmother's old house in a quiet town hidden among the mountains. I was only a kid, but I still remember every detail as if it happened yesterday. Growing up, visiting my grandmother was always the best part of my vacations. Her house smelled of fresh bread, cinnamon, and firewood. It was the kind of place where laughter filled every room, and every corner made you feel safe. But that year, something felt different. I couldn't explain it at the time. No one else seemed to notice, but the moment we arrived, an uneasy feeling settled deep inside me. It wasn't exactly fear. It was the strange sensation that something was waiting for us. The drive had been long. As we climbed the narrow mountain roads, the bright blue sky slowly disappeared behind thick gray clouds that barely moved. The higher we went, the colder the air became. When we finally reached the property, the house looked older than I remembered. The garden my grandmother had once cared for with so much love had been swallowed by wild vegetation. Flowers had disappeared beneath tangled weeds, and even the aloe plants she treasured were gone. She had grown too weak to keep up with the land she loved. The wooden walls carried the scars of time, and the roof smelled of damp wood after years of constant moisture. Beyond the house, the mountains vanished beneath a layer of fog that never seemed to disappear completely. Everything felt unusually quiet. Too quiet. The adults didn't seem to notice. They immediately started preparing dinner, catching up after months apart, laughing as if nothing around them had changed. Meanwhile, my younger cousins, Michael and Ethan, along with my little sister, Emily, couldn't wait to explore the woods surrounding the property. At first, I stayed behind, watching them disappear between the trees. I was older, and for some reason, I wasn't eager to follow. But curiosity has a way of winning. A few minutes later, I stepped into the forest after them, never imagining that crossing that invisible line would become the biggest mistake of my life. When I finally caught up with them, they seemed even more excited. Together, we wandered deeper into the woods than we ever had before. We laughed as we ducked beneath low branches and stepped over tangled roots, completely ignoring the stories the adults used to tell us about staying away from that part of the forest. Back then, I thought those stories were just meant to scare children. As we kept walking, the forest slowly began to change. The trees grew taller, their twisted branches stretching across the sky like enormous claws. Very little sunlight reached the ground, leaving us surrounded by shifting shadows that never seemed to stay in the same place. The familiar scent of wet soil slowly gave way to something much older, something damp and decaying. Then the silence became impossible to ignore. There were no birds, no insects, not even the sound of the wind. It felt as though every living creature had abandoned that place. Emily suddenly stopped walking. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We all froze. For several long seconds, none of us moved. We listened carefully. At first, nothing. Then a faint voice drifted through the fog. "Please, help me." It was so soft that I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It didn't sound like an echo. It sounded as though someone was standing just beyond the next row of trees. We looked at each other, silently asking the same question. Had everyone heard it? "I'm sure someone needs help," Michael said as he cautiously stepped forward. Before anyone could stop him, he began following the voice. Ethan went after him. Emily hesitated for only a moment before following them. Every instinct I had told me to turn around. Something about that voice didn't feel right. But I couldn't let them go alone. So I followed. With every step, the fog grew thicker. Soon, we could barely see a few feet ahead of us. The ground became softer beneath our shoes, almost like a swamp, pulling at our feet with every step. And somehow, the voice sounded even closer. "Please, don't leave me here." We kept following the voice until the trees suddenly opened into a small clearing. The fog lingered around the edges like a wall, refusing to let us see beyond it. In the center stood a single tree, unlike any of the others. Its trunk was enormous, blackened with age, and twisted into unnatural shapes that looked almost human. Thick roots spread across the ground like giant veins disappearing beneath the wet earth. Then we saw her. She was tied to the trunk with an old, weathered rope. At least, that's what it looked like at first. The closer I stared, the harder it became to understand what I was seeing. Her skin wasn't simply pressed against the bark. It was becoming part of it. The wood had grown around her arms, her shoulders, even parts of her face, as though the tree had been slowly swallowing her for years. She looked painfully thin. Her pale skin blended into the dark bark until it was difficult to tell where her body ended and the tree began. Slowly, she raised her head. Her eyes met mine. I have never forgotten that look. There was fear in them, desperation, and something else. Something I still can't explain. She lifted one trembling hand toward us. The fingers were unnaturally long. Her fingernails were black, cracked, and sharp enough to resemble claws. "Please, help me." Her voice was barely audible, little more than a broken whisper. None of us moved. I wanted to help. Every part of me wanted to untie the rope and pull her away from that tree. But another part, one far stronger, was screaming that if I took even one more step, something unimaginable would happen. Emily clutched my arm so tightly that her nails dug into my skin. What is she?" she whispered. No one answered, because none of us knew. For what felt like an eternity, we simply stood there, staring at the impossible figure before us. The woman never blinked. She only watched us, waiting, hoping, or perhaps luring us closer. The silence finally broke when Ethan took a slow step backward. "We have to get the adults," he said, his voice shaking. "We can't do this ourselves." No one argued. I couldn't stop staring at the woman, but deep down I knew he was right. If she was real, we needed help. If she wasn't, then we needed to get as far away from that place as possible. The instant we turned around, we ran. Branches whipped across our faces. Roots caught our feet. The soaked ground seemed determined to pull us down with every desperate step. The fog became so thick that I could barely see my cousins only a few feet ahead of me. Still, we kept running. Behind us, the woman's voice drifted through the trees. First, it was weak. Then it became clearer. "Closer. Please. Don't leave me." Every word filled me with unbearable guilt. I wanted to believe we were abandoning someone who truly needed saving. But there was something about that voice that didn't sound human anymore. It no longer felt like a plea. It sounded like a trap. I never looked back. Even now, after all these years, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had. By the time we reached my grandmother's house, we were exhausted. Our clothes were soaked. Our faces were pale. We burst through the front door, struggling to catch our breath as every adult in the room turned toward us. At first, they laughed. They assumed we'd scared ourselves with another childhood adventure. But as we tried to explain what we had seen, the laughter slowly disappeared. The room fell silent. I watched the expressions on my parents' and uncles change from amusement to confusion. Only my grandmother reacted differently. The moment she heard about the woman tied to the tree, the color drained from her face. She didn't ask us to repeat the story. She didn't question whether we had imagined it. Instead, she stood up with surprising determination. Despite her frail body, her voice carried a firmness I had never heard before. "Take me there." No one dared to refuse her. The walk back to the forest felt completely different. No one spoke. The adults carried flashlights, but even their beams struggled to cut through the thick fog that had settled over the woods. My grandmother walked slowly, leaning on my uncle for support. She never asked us any questions. She already seemed to know exactly where we were going. When we reached the clearing, I felt my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The tree was still there, dark, twisted, silent. But the woman, she was gone. There was no rope, no footprints, no sign that anyone had ever been there. Only the massive tree stood in the center of the clearing, its bark so dark it looked as though someone had poured burned oil over its trunk years ago. The adults searched every corner of the area. They circled the tree again and again. Nothing. It was as if the forest had erased every trace of what we had witnessed. Then my grandmother slowly stepped forward. She placed one trembling hand against the rough bark. Lowering her head, she began whispering words I couldn't understand. A prayer. Or perhaps something much older. The instant she started speaking, the wind rose without warning. The branches above us groaned. Leaves rustled all around the clearing, even though moments earlier the forest had been completely still. A cold gust swept past us, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. Every child instinctively stepped back. No one told us to. We simply knew we shouldn't get any closer. For several long minutes, my grandmother remained standing before that tree, quietly praying while the wind circled around her. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The forest became silent again. She turned toward us. There were tears in her eyes. Not tears of fear. Tears of sorrow. She looked at the adults before finally speaking. What they saw was real. No one interrupted her. No one even breathed. Because somehow, we all knew she was telling the truth. My grandmother took one last look at the tree before speaking again. "Long before any of us were born," she said quietly, "there was a woman who lived alone deep in these woods. The people believed she practiced dark rituals. They feared her, and eventually, they stopped seeing her as human." No one said a word. The only sound came from the wind moving through the branches above us. One day she disappeared. My grandmother continued. Some believed she died. Others believed the forest claimed her. But the oldest stories say she became part of this place. She rested her hand against the blackened trunk. The trees remember everything. A chill ran through my entire body. I wanted to ask what she meant, but something kept me silent. "For reasons no one truly understands," she whispered, "she sometimes shows herself to those who wander too far." My father frowned. "So, she's a ghost?" My grandmother slowly shook her head. "I don't think so." Her answer somehow felt even more unsettling. "Whatever she is now, she cannot leave this place." She paused before looking directly at us. "And she cannot harm anyone who refuses to answer her call." I felt my stomach tighten. That meant she hadn't been asking for help. She had been trying to bring us closer. My grandmother closed her eyes for a moment. "Respect this forest," she said. "Respect her resting place. Never mock it. Never disturb it. Some things are meant to stay exactly where they are. No one argued. No one laughed. The walk back to the house was quieter than the walk there. That night, no one mentioned the woman again. Dinner was served. Conversations resumed. But they sounded forced. Every adult avoided looking toward the forest outside the windows. And every child slept with the lights on. Even then, none of us truly believed the nightmare was over. We never returned to that part of the forest. Not once. Whenever my family visited my grandmother after that summer, we stayed close to the house. The woods that had once felt magical became a place no one even mentioned. It was as if an unspoken rule had settled over the family. Some memories were better left untouched. As the years passed, my grandmother changed. She had always been the heart of our family, full of warmth and quiet wisdom. But after that day in the forest, something in her seemed to fade. Sometimes I would catch her staring out the kitchen window toward the mountains, her expression distant, as though she were remembering something she wished she could forget. She never spoke about the woman again. Neither did we. Eventually, my grandmother passed away. A few years later, the old house was abandoned. Without anyone living there, nature slowly reclaimed the property. The garden disappeared beneath weeds. The walls began to crumble. The forest expanded until it nearly surrounded the house completely. Time erased almost every trace of the place where so many childhood memories had been made. At least, that's what I believed. Until 2 months ago. One evening, my aunt sent our family a video recorded by an urban explorer who specialized in visiting abandoned places. To our surprise, he had found my grandmother's house. Watching the footage felt unreal. Every room looked exactly as I remembered, only older and consumed by decay. The explorer treated the property with respect, never mocking its history or damaging anything. But as the video continued, something caught all of our attention. There were unmistakable signs that someone had been visiting the forest. Not hikers. Not curious teenagers. Someone had been performing strange rituals among the trees. Symbols had been drawn into the ground. Burned candles surrounded parts of the clearing. Small offerings had been carefully arranged at the base of several trees. The camera only captured them for a few seconds. But that was enough. The moment I saw those images, I remembered every word my grandmother had spoken that day. Some things are meant to stay exactly where they are. I watched that video several times, hoping I had misunderstood what I was seeing. I hadn't. The symbols were different from anything I recognized, but one thing was obvious. Someone had returned to that forest with a purpose. Ever since then, I haven't been able to stop thinking about the woman we found all those years ago. Sometimes I wonder if she is still there, waiting beneath the same ancient tree, calling out to anyone willing to listen. Or maybe she was never trapped at all. Maybe the tree wasn't her prison. Maybe it was the only thing keeping her from leaving. My grandmother believed the forest remembered everything. Back then, I thought those were simply the words of an old woman trying to protect her grandchildren from wandering too far. Now, I'm not so sure. The older I get, the more I realize how little we truly understand about the places that existed long before we were born. There are forests no map can fully explain. Stories that survive because someone lived through them. And secrets that remain buried only because most people are wise enough to leave them alone. Sometimes I catch myself wondering what would have happened if we had listened to that voice. If we had untied the rope. If we had taken one more step toward that tree. Those questions have followed me for years. And I hope they remain unanswered. Because if the people visiting those woods are trying to awaken something that was never meant to return, I fear they may eventually succeed. And if that day ever comes, I pray no one answers the voice that whispers from the fog, begging for help. If you enjoyed these stories and want to hear more terrifying encounters, forgotten legends, and unexplained mysteries, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next upload. If this story gave you chills, leave a like. It really helps the channel and lets me know you want more stories like this. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think was really trapped inside that ancient tree? Was it truly a witch, or was the tree imprisoning something far more dangerous? Let me know your theory in the comments.